in housing crisis after a major report found the government's plan needs work.
In recent years, the Australian housing market has faced significant challenges that have driven housing affordability to crisis levels. Across the nation, the dream of owning a home has become increasingly elusive for many Australians, particularly younger generations and low to middle income earners. The combination of rising property prices, stagnant wages, and a lack of adequate housing supply has led to an affordability gap, exacerbating economic inequality and contributing to social instability. Number 1, historical overview of housing affordability in Australia. Housing affordability has been a contentious issue in Australia for decades, but it has worsened significantly since the early 2000s. Post-war Australia enjoyed relatively affordable housing driven by steady wage growth, modest population increases, and abundant land availability in cities like Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. However, since the turn of the century, a confluence of factors has caused a dramatic shift. According to CoreLogic Housing Affordability Report, since the 1980s, property prices have increased at a rate that far outpaced income growth. In the 1980s, the median house price was roughly 3 to 4 times the median household income. Fast forward to today, and the median house price in cities like Sydney is over 8 to 10 times the median household income. Number 2, key factors driving the affordability crisis. A range of structural and economic factors have contributed to the current affordability crisis. These include A, population growth and migration. Australia's population has grown rapidly in recent decades, primarily through immigration. In 2023, Australia welcomed record high levels of migration, which in turn increased demand for housing. This was particularly acute in metropolitan areas like Sydney and Melbourne, where much of the population increase has been concentrated. According to CoreLogic, this growth has exacerbated the housing supply shortage, pushing prices higher in high demand urban areas. And B, supply side constraints. One of the main causes of the housing affordability crisis is the shortage of housing supply. Australia's housing construction industry has not kept pace with demand, particularly in high demand areas like Sydney and Melbourne. This has been attributed to several factors, including stringent land use regulations, zoning restrictions, and high developer fees. The time taken to approve and build new housing developments is lengthy, leading to further supply bottlenecks. In many parts of the country, especially long critical transport corridors, high-density housing developments are opposed to by local communities due to local concerns about overcrowding, traffic congestion, and environmental impacts. This resistance to higher density development has hampered efforts to build affordable housing. And C, foreign investment and speculation. Foreign investment in Australian property markets, particularly from wealthy individuals and corporations in countries like China, the US, and others, has been another factor driving up prices. Foreign buyers have been attracted to Australia's stable economy and legal framework, making real estate a safe investment. This speculative buying has contributed to price inflation, particularly in already expensive areas, and has made it difficult for local buyers to compete. And D, tax policies and incentives. Australia's tax policies have been criticised for favouring property investors over first-time home buyers. Negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions allow investors to offset losses on investment properties against their taxable income, making property a more attractive investment vehicle. These policies have fueled demand for investors, driving up property prices and reducing the availability of affordable housing for owner-occupiers. E, low interest rates and easy access to credit. The Reserve Bank of Australia's historical low interest rates in years leading up to 2022 made borrowing cheaper and encouraged property buyers to take out larger mortgages. While this helps stimulate the economy during periods of economic downturn, it also contributed to increased demand for housing and further price inflation. Even as interest rates began to rise in 2022 to combat inflation, the demand for housing remains strong, particularly in high demand areas. Wealth inequality. Another contributing factor to the affordability crisis is growing wealth inequality in Australia. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest Australians has widened over the past 2 decades. Wealthier individuals, particularly those in higher income brackets, have been able to purchase multiple properties, further driving up prices and pushing lower income Australians out of the market. Number 3, impacts of the housing affordability crisis. The housing affordability crisis has far-reaching impacts on Australian society. These include economic, social, and environmental consequences. Economic consequences. Housing affordability is intrinsically linked to economic well-being. When housing becomes unaffordable, it can limit economic mobility, discourage saving, and increase household debt. Many Australians are now committing a larger portion of their income to mortgage repayments, which reduces their capacity to spend on other goods and services, dampening economic growth. In fact, the proportion of household income devoted to housing costs has risen significantly over the past decade. CoreLogic estimates that as of 2024, Australian households spend an average of 36% of their income on mortgage repayments. The impact on younger generations has been particularly severe. Millennials and Gen Z Australians face higher property prices and stagnant wages, making home ownership an increasingly distant dream for many. According to a 2024 report by the Housing Australia and Urban Research Institute, fewer younger people are able to afford their first home, and those who do are taking on larger mortgages. As a result, many young Australians are delaying life milestones like marriage, starting a family, or moving out of the rental market. Social consequences. The affordability crisis has also had significant social consequences, including a rise in homelessness, housing insecurity, and social inequality. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare reported that in 2023, over 108,000 Australians were seeking specialist homelessness services. This represents a sharp increase from previous years and is partly attributed to rising rents and a shortage of affordable housing. In addition to homelessness, the rental market has become increasingly competitive, with rents skyrocketing across the country. CoreLogic data from 2023 revealed that the median rent in Sydney had increased to over $650 per week, while in Melbourne it had risen $500 per week. This has led to housing stress for many Australians, particularly low-income households who spend a significant proportion of their income on rent. Environmental and urban planning challenges. The housing affordability crisis is also presenting challenges in terms of urban planning and environmental sustainability. With increasing pressure to build more housing in metropolitan areas, there is growing debate over how to balance the need for affordable housing with environmental protection and sustainable development. Urban sprawl and the development of greenfield sites on outskirts of cities are contributing to deforestation, habitat destruction, and increased carbon emissions due to longer commutes. Also, efforts to increase housing density in inner cities areas have been met with resistance from local residents who are concerned about the loss of green spaces, congestion, and changes to the character of their neighborhoods. Finding a sustainable solution to the housing crisis requires careful planning and coordination between governments, developers, and communities. Number 4, government responses and policy solutions. Over the years, federal and state governments have introduced various policies and programs to address the housing affordability crisis. However, many of these measures have been criticised as inadequate and ineffective. A. First home buyer grants and schemes. One of the key initiatives aimed at improving house affordability is the First Home Owner Grant, introduced in 2000. This grant provides financial assistance to eligible first home buyers to help them enter the housing market. In addition to the First Home Owner Grant, various state and territory governments have introduced stamp duty concessions and deposit guarantee schemes to support first home buyers. While these initiatives have helped some Australians purchase their first home, they have been criticised for not addressing the root causes of the affordability crisis. In many cases, these grants and concessions have simply fueled demand, driving up property prices further. B. National Housing and Homelessness Agreement. In 2024, the federal government allocated $9.3 billion to the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement to provide funding for social and affordable housing and homelessness services. The agreement aims to increase the supply of affordable housing, particularly for vulnerable Australians, and reduce homelessness. However, critics argue that the funding allocated to the NHHA is insufficient to address the scale of the problem. In particular, the construction of new social and affordable housing has not kept pace with demand, and waiting lists for public housing continue to grow. C. Planning and zoning reforms. To address supply-side constraints, several state governments have introduced planning and zoning reforms to increase the availability of land for housing development. For example, New South Wales, the state government has proposed increasing housing density along key transport corridors to accommodate population growth. This would involve relaxing zoning restrictions to allow for the construction of more high-density apartments and townhouses. While these reforms have the potential to increase housing supply, they face opposition from local communities and environmental groups who are concerned about overdevelopment and the impact on local amenities and infrastructure. D. Taxation reform. There have been consistent calls for reform of Australia's tax system, particularly the negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions, which many believe distort the housing market. Negative gearing allows investors to deduct losses made on investment properties from their taxable income, which can create artificially high demand for housing. Similarly, the capital gains tax concession, which allows investors to pay less tax on profits from selling properties, further incentivizes property speculation. Reform advocates argue that these policies disproportionately benefit wealthy Australians and property investors, driving up prices and reducing housing affordability for first-time buyers. In response, some policymakers have proposed limiting or abolishing these concessions to discourage speculative investment and reduce demand in property market. However, these proposals have faced strong political opposition as property investment remains a cornerstone of wealth accumulation for many Australians. E. Build to rent and social housing initiatives. One potential solution to the affordability crisis is the growth of the build to rent sector. Build to rent developments are residential complexes where the units are rented out rather than sold, offering tenants longer term rental security and higher quality amenities than typical rental properties. In 2024, the federal government announced an additional $1.9 billion in concessional financing to support the construction of build-to-rent and community housing projects, with the aim of increasing affordable rental stock. Also, government investment in social and affordable housing has been another focus. In the 2024-25 budget, the federal government allocated $423 million to the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement to expand public housing and support homeless Australians. While these measures are a positive step, many housing experts argue that the level of investment remains insufficient to address the scale of the housing shortage. Abolishing stamp duty. Stamp duty reform has also been proposed as a way to improve housing affordability. Stamp duty is a tax paid by buyers when purchasing property, and it can significantly increase the upfront cost of buying a home. Critics argue that a stamp duty is an inefficient tax that discourages home ownership and mobility, especially among first-time buyers. In recent years, some states, including New South Wales and Victoria, have begun exploring options to phase out stamp duty and replace it with a broad-based land tax. This would reduce the upfront cost of purchasing property and spread the tax burden more evenly over time. However, the transition to such a system would be complex and could face resistance from those who benefit from the current arrangements. Number 5, the future of housing affordability in Australia. As Australians move forward, it is clear that resolving the housing affordability crisis will require a comprehensive and multifaceted approach. Simply introducing new policies to stimulate demand or provide financial support to first-time buyers is unlikely to address the root causes of the problem. Instead, governments must focus on increasing housing supply, reforming taxation and planning systems, and investing in long-term solutions such as social housing and sustainable urban development. Increasing housing supply. To alleviate pressure on the housing market, it is essential to significantly increase the supply of new homes, particularly in high demand areas. This will require both public and private investment in new housing developments, as well as reforms to planning and zoning regulations to allow for higher density development in urban areas. Ensuring that new developments are well serviced by transport and other infrastructure will be crucial to making these areas attractive and livable. Sustainable urban development. As Australia continues to grow, it is important to ensure that new housing developments are environmentally sustainable and do not contribute to further urban sprawl. Building higher density housing in established areas close to transport links, schools and amenities can help reduce environmental impact of new developments while improving access to jobs and services for residents. Addressing rental affordability. In addition to tackling home ownership affordability, policymakers must also address the rising cost of rent. Expanding the build-to-rent sector and increasing the availability of social housing will be key to providing more affordable and secure rental options for Australians. Reforms to rental laws that provide greater security for tenants, such as longer-term leases and restrictions on rent increases, could also help alleviate rental stress. Supporting first-time homebuyers. First-time homebuyers face unique challenges in the current market, particularly when it comes to saving for a deposit. Programs such as the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme, which allows eligible buyers to purchase a home with a deposit as low as 5%, have been a positive step. However, additional support such as further subsidies or expanded eligibility criteria may be needed to help more Australians achieve home ownership. The housing affordability crisis in Australia is a complex issue driven by a range of factors, including population growth, supply-side constraints, foreign investment, and tax policies. The impacts of the crisis are widespread, affecting not only potential home buyers, but also renters and lower income Australians who are increasingly facing housing stress and homelessness. While recent government initiatives such as increased funding for social housing and reforms to planning laws are positive steps, much more needs to be done to address the root causes of the affordability crisis. A comprehensive approach that includes increasing housing supply, reforming tax policies, and promoting sustainable urban development will be essential if Australia is to provide affordable housing for all of its citizens. Well, that's all for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.